Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Israel has resumed the war in Gaza with ferocious intensity. Already something like 1,000 people have been killed in the last 1 week alone. So today we ask, what is Israel's intention, and has the time come for the rest of the world to intervene and stop the fighting? Joining me from London is the Chief Executive of Oxfam, Dhananjayan Sriskandarajah. Danny Sriskandarajah, how do you view the resumption of fighting in Gaza, which has happened with intensified ferocity? In the last 1 week, over 1,000 people have been killed, and the total death toll has now exceeded 17,000. The UN says 1.9 million out of 2.3 million people are internally displaced. And on top of everything, Prime Minister Netanyahu is now threatening crushing force. So let me start by asking, how do you view what's happening in Gaza at the moment?
This is a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. Oxfam has been around for 80-odd years now. We've worked in some of the most challenging humanitarian contexts around the world in our history. And even in the 5 years I've served at Oxfam, I've visited our programs in places like Yemen, in Somalia, in Iraq. These are incredibly difficult situations, but what we're seeing in Gaza today is truly heartbreaking. And in many ways, it's unprecedented. My own colleagues, and we have 30-odd people inside Gaza, normally would be running relief services, but today they're running for their lives. Normally, in other contexts, we would be in constant contact with these colleagues. Today, we can't get hold of them because the internet is down, electricity doesn't work. Normally, in other contexts, we would be informing the combatants where our staff and civilians are to avoid anyone being harmed. But in Gaza today, no one is safe. And what I heard yesterday from a partner organization in Gaza was that the resumption of hostilities has felt worse than ever before. The first few weeks of this war were bad enough. But for people who had experienced the pause, there was at least a sense of hope that there'd be a break in the cycle of violence. But the resumption of violence in the last few weeks, according to this partner, has felt more devastating than the beginning of the hostilities, because the hope seems dashed that we can't have a stop to this violence.
A couple of days ago, Jan Egeland, the head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, said to the BBC, and I'm quoting him, he said, "What's happening in Gaza is amongst the worst assaults on any civilian population in our time and age." And he added, "The situation in Gaza is a total failure of our shared humanity." Would you agree with that?
Sadly, I agree completely. And let's just again look at the historical precedent here. We are not talking about a natural disaster here. This is a human-made disaster where lives are being lost, thousands and thousands of people are being killed, innocent children are dying at a rate of 1 every 10 minutes. And we have between us, the world community, the means to prevent further loss of life. And this is a collective failure of our shared humanity. And again, if I come back to Oxfam's founding, we were the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, and we were founded at the height of the Second World War, because on the principle that innocent human life should not be lost, even in the height of conflict. Wars have laws. Innocent lives should be protected. There are humanitarian principles that should mean that even in the height of the ugliest conflict, we should do our very best to protect innocent civilians. And what's not happening in Gaza today is that those innocent civilians are not being protected, and the world needs to do much, much more.
Now, both the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and Joseph Borrell of the European Union have called for a ceasefire. Israel, on the other hand, has repeatedly said that it is adamantly against a ceasefire at this stage. In your opinion, is a ceasefire essential? And if it is, how essential is it?
It's absolutely essential. What we're seeing in Gaza, let's not forget, is a situation that was already difficult well before the October 7th. 80% of Gazans were reliant on humanitarian aid. Colleagues of mine that were working in Gaza were trying to provide safe, clean drinking water in a very inhospitable place. And what's happened since then, of course, is this total devastation. The entire infrastructure has been knocked out: water, sanitation, electricity, food supply. The small farms that were existing have all been completely knocked out. And a ceasefire, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, can help a little bit, because with a little bit of aid flowing in, we can start to bring bottled water, for example. We can start to bring food and hygiene kits. But only a ceasefire will allow us to rebuild the pumping station so we can desalinate water and bring clean, safe drinking water to people. Only a ceasefire will allow us to rehabilitate the sewage plants so that people aren't desperately living in conditions where there are no toilets and they're having to take part in open defecation, a very dangerous public health situation. And so a ceasefire is essential because we need the certainty. The humanitarian sector a certainty to be able to respond to the scale and intensity of need. A pause itself is not good enough, and the resumption of hostilities is the worst thing imaginable.
Now, two countries that are critical to Israel because of the incredible persistent support they give Tel Aviv are the United States and the United Kingdom. Neither has deliberately called for a ceasefire as yet. That is a deliberate decision their governments have taken. How do you view this refusal to act, this refusal to call for a ceasefire? Do you see it simply as a political decision, or do you believe it also has moral implications?
I'm afraid it has both. There is certainly a moral failure here on part of many political leaders around the world. And we are, and the entire humanitarian sector is disappointed that there isn't a ceasefire. We're disappointed that political leaders are not doing everything they can and not saying everything that they can about a ceasefire. And what we saw in the pause a few weeks ago is a glimmer of hope, is the fact that at least a ceasefire is possible, that the warring parties were prepared to negotiate, that hostages were able to be released. And it was fantastic to see that process happening. And so, in my mind, it shows that a political resolution, or at least a ceasefire, is possible. And so why aren't our leaders, or why aren't some of our leaders doing all that they can, saying all that they can to bring about one? And I think, the failure to call up for a ceasefire, to me, is an instance where sort of political imperatives seem to be trumping what is morally right. And that I do wish that our politicians had more moral courage to call for what is the only way of breaking this cycle of violence.
Now, for its part, Israel insists that the people in South Gaza must move to what Israel calls safe zones, and Israel has supposedly identified some 640 such places. However, the BBC has gone on record to say that you need smartphones and the internet to access the QR codes to actually establish where these so-called safe zones are. And at the moment, the internet is not functioning. Furthermore, Israel has also identified a place called Al-Mawasi as its preferred safe zone. But according to Paul Adams, the diplomatic correspondent of the BBC, Al-Mawasi is literally barren land without any facilities, no hospital, not even adequate residential accommodation. So how does Oxfam view the possibility that something like 2 million people could be forcibly pushed into Al-Mawasi, an area which is supposedly just 2.5 kilometers by 4 kilometers? It's minuscule.
Yes, absolutely. Look, the Gaza Strip is already, the whole of the Gaza Strip is a tiny place. It's one of the most densely populated places on the planet. I was there just a few months ago and saw how crowded the place is. It's effectively a very large, very densely populated urban area. And so this idea that you can all, cram up to 2 million people into a tiny area, Al Mawasi, which is one of the places that's been talked about as a safe zone, is tiny. It's a space that's just a few kilometers wide, as you say. It's, you know, the size of Delhi Airport. Can you imagine area with no infrastructure, and that it just is an inhumane situation to force people in. It's forcible displacement. And the other thing we should remember is the history of safe zones in war zones around the world is not a good one. They have tended not to work. People fear that they may become sort of killing zones because the warring parties could know exactly where civilians are, and of course the instructions that people are being given are extremely difficult to interpret. As you say, you need to scan a QR code. You need a functioning internet. You need electricity. You need your battery charge. Older people may not know how to use a QR code, and of course the zoning of Gaza into these blocks is also little understood, is what I'm hearing from our colleagues and partners on the ground. And so it feels like this is being portrayed as a sort of clinical exercise, a very technical exercise, but it's far from that. It's far from that, and it's a tragedy that people are having to move in such desperate conditions to a tiny plot of land.
We lost you for 10 seconds in the middle of that answer, but I want to confirm something that I think the audience half heard you say. It was so evocative that I'm repeating it so that you can correct me. You said that Al Mawasi is the size of Heathrow Airport. That is how small it is.
Exactly. If you take the plot of land, it's the total size of London's Heathrow Airport, half the size of Delhi Airport, if you want an Indian comparator. It's a tiny piece of land, but unlike those places, there's no running water, there's no toilets, there's no electricity. And so, a million or more people are being asked to crowd into this tiny plot of land with absolutely no infrastructure.
Now, another connected question with this talk about moving people, and we're talking about moving 2 million people, not just a small handful, into so-called safe zones, is, are they actually safe? The people of Gaza were first told to go south for their safety. So in their hundreds of thousands, and maybe by now it's over 1 million, they moved from North Gaza to South Gaza. When they got to South Gaza, they found they were being bombed in Khan Yunis, they were being bombed in Rafah. And if anything, the bombing in Khan Yunis and Rafah is as intense as it was in the north. So is there a case for saying that they were deliberately misled and deluded into believing that the South would be safe? They came looking for safety, but ended up being bombed just as badly in the South as they were in the North.
Look, it's not for Oxfam to determine whether there were deliberate actions or not. But what we can say, and what we know from the experiences of our colleagues and partners, is that the unintended consequences of this bombing that's going, as you say, intensely all over the Gaza Strip, is a tragedy to the extent that, in a tightly populated area like that, any bomb, any attack is going to have unintended consequences at a scale that is unimaginable. And that's the problem here, that this is being portrayed as a situation in which you can have sort of surgical attacks with no collateral damage. That's just impossible in a place like Gaza. And so, under international humanitarian principles, combating parties need to do all that they can to minimize civilian death. And our fear is, in this context, it's almost impossible to minimize civilian death. And as you say, all over Gaza now, there has been bombing, and there is there is no safe zone. There's nowhere in Gaza that we're being told is safe at the moment.
Let me at this point put to you a thought that is a dominant theme in the global south, particularly in my own country, India. And increasingly, I discover it's a thought that occurs to the hundreds of thousands protesting in London and New York. And maybe it's a thought that's occurred to you in Oxfam as well. Israel, it seems, is determined to obliterate Hamas, no matter what the cost in civilian Palestine lives. It seems to believe that the end justifies the means, no matter how horrific the means. Given the horror of what Hamas did, and I'm not in any way playing that down, the brutality, the savagery, does the end justify the means? Is it justified to obliterate Hamas, no matter how many Palestinian lives it takes to do so?
Look, what we have to be clear about is that Israel, of course, has a right to defend itself. And as you say, what happened on the 7th of October in Israel was atrocious, and what's been happening to the hostages is a crime, is a war crime, and that is horrific to have seen. But in this case, we also need to recognize that Israel has to do all that it can to minimize impact on civilians, and that's what we're really worried about. And that phrase "end justifying the means" to me is very troubling, because I don't know what the end game here is in this particular war, because the escalation of violence in the way that we have seen is not going to break the cycle of violence that we've seen over decades in this troubled region. You can't bomb hope out of a people. And if we are to bring about some sort of sustainable, just peace in Israel and Palestine, we need to find a different approach to the one that we have today. And that's what worries me, that we need to rebuild peace. It's not like Gaza before the 7th of October was some sort of paradise. Many called it the world's largest open-air prison. 70%, 80% of the population was in need of humanitarian assistance. Unemployment was 70%. And so we need to think about, what is the end we want? We want an end in which people in Gaza, people in Israel, can live safely side by side, where there is opportunity for people to put their talents to use in productive ways. And that's my fear, that no one seems to be talking about, how do we get to that sort of situation? How do we break this cycle of violence?
Mr. Sriskandarajah, you said something in that answer that caught my attention immediately, and I think I can quote your words exactly. You said Israel has to do all it can to minimize the impact on civilians. But is Israel doing all it can?
We worry that not enough is being done, that the response has not been proportionate, that some, especially when there are civilian objects, as it's called in international law, that are under attack, hospitals, for example, the requirement under international humanitarian law is even higher, because there are certain targets, if you will, where combatants have to take extra care. And we fear that in recent weeks there have been instances where that care does not seem to have been taken, and that's our worry.
Tell me, in these circumstances, how easy, or more appropriately, I should say, how badly hampered are attempts by organizations like Oxfam to provide humanitarian assistance? I noticed the BBC went on record yesterday to say no aid has reached the north since the truce ended, and today is the 8th day after the truce ended.
Look, providing humanitarian assistance in Gaza before the 7th of October was difficult enough. Gaza relied on hundreds of trucks a day to provide essential fuel, equipment, supplies. That's almost stopped over the last 2 months. And what little aid has come in, as you say, remains mostly in the south. And organizations like ours, the Egyptian Red Cross, Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, we're all trying to do our level best to get as much in from Egypt. That's a difficult, time-consuming, cumbersome process. It's an expensive process. For example, we're bringing bottled water in. Thousands of cubic meters of bottled water is having to be brought in because there just isn't enough clean, safe drinking water inside Gaza. Human beings need, we think, 10 to 15 liters a day of clean water to survive, not just for drinking water, but to wash food, for basic sanitation. In Gaza, we think people have 2 to 3 liters a day at the moment. And to bring in the level of water through tracking across a border that's highly securitized is the most sort of cumbersome, difficult way of providing life-saving necessities into Gaza.
You have people still working in Gaza in the most horrific of circumstances. They're doing an absolutely sterling job, and I think everyone all over the world would applaud them for what they're doing. We keep being told that Gaza has become a graveyard for children, a catastrophe. To quote Egeland, the worst assault on any civilian population in our time and age. When you talk to your people who are there on the ground, facing the same bombing that everyone else faces, how horrible is it for them?
You're right. My colleagues are some of the most brave people I have encountered in my professional life. They're all Palestinians, many from Gaza. They've remained, they've doing what they can. Even amidst all of this, they're doing their very best to help their fellow Gazans. And, they only have one message for us when we do reach them on the internet or on their phones, and that is, stop this violence. Do all that you can, raise your voice, put political pressure on everyone to stop this. And you say graveyard for children. One of my most poignant memories from my trip to Gaza a few months ago was meeting a young man. He was 15 years old, the same age as one of my children. So he was born after the blockade started in Gaza, and he told me that he dreams of being a scientist, just like my son. But he's never seen a microscope, because microscopes are one of the several thousand items that were prohibited from entering Gaza because they could be used for military purposes. And so I can't help thinking, for the last 2 months, I can't help thinking about young men like him, thinking they were already living an awful life, not being able to fulfill their dreams. And now, for 2 months, almost relentlessly, they've been facing this situation. And as I said earlier, my heart breaks to think that, how can we create a world so that young men like that can fulfill their potential, can become scientists? And I know that seems like a long way away, but that should be what should be on our mind today. How do we stop this violence, and how do we rebuild a lasting and just peace for everyone in that region?
You say when you speak to your people, your colleagues, your friends in Gaza, the one message they give you is stop the violence. The problem is neither Israel nor America, the one country that can influence Israel, have set a timeline for the military operation to stop. In fact, they adamantly refuse to set a timeline. By some accounts, it said that the violence could continue not for weeks, but for months. How do you view that prospect?
It is going to be an even greater tragedy. I mean, look, let's not forget, winter is fast approaching. And in the desert, in those sort of areas, it can get very cold. So already people are sleeping in the open air in many cases. We are worried about the public health disaster that is waiting to happen here. There's open defecation. There's one toilet, it's estimated, for about 500 people, but not even enough running water to keep it clean. And so there are conditions here that are rife for a public health disaster. Diseases like cholera can spread very quickly to make this grave situation even worse. And so every day counts here. And I think that's what we have to remind all of our political leaders, that every day lost means more lives unnecessarily lost, a greater failure of our shared humanity, as we said at the start of this. And we need to underline the urgency of resolving this situation. And it is heartbreaking that politicians do not have the moral courage to try to do all that they can to bring this to an end.
Finally, Mr. Sriskandarajah, from everything that you've seen, you've heard, what is your message to Prime Minister Netanyahu? And beyond that, what is your message to the one man in the world who can influence him, President Biden?
My message to them is the same as the message to all political leaders. We have to break this cycle of violence. We have to find a lasting, just, sustainable peace. And the world has done all sorts of amazing, remarkable things to bring about peace in different parts of the world, even in the most intractable places. And we need that effort again. Where is that political courage? Where is that leadership from these folk? to be creative, to come up with workable solutions. We've done it before and we desperately need to do it again, and not just keep pursuing a war that is having tragic consequences all over the region.
So the paramount necessity of the moment is an immediate ceasefire.
Absolutely. That's the only thing that can bring some relief to those 2 million people who are suffering in Gaza at the moment, and some relief for the families of hostages who are eagerly waiting for them to be returned.
Mr. Sriskandarajah, thank you very much for making time for me and for talking to me. And my applause and my congratulations to your valiant staff who are doing a terrific job in Gaza.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on The Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.